Why does an apple fall down and not up? Why is the sky blue? Why are you watching this video?
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
Why do we even ask the question, why? For asking the question why implies that we expect a reason to be there that is able to satisfy our inquiry. Furthermore, this reason should satisfy our inquiry in its totality, for otherwise it would not be a sufficient reason. For example, saying that the apple falls down because it wants to is the same as the answer that the doctor gave in the play of Molière, where he asked, "How does opium induce sleep?" "Because it contains a dormitive virtue whose nature is to put the senses to sleep," answers the doctor. However, most of us do not buy this argument that something just happens by its own virtue. That this is a brute fact. No, we need a sufficient reason. And by virtue of the principle of sufficient reason, we accept that no fact can be true or actual, no judgment correct, without having sufficient reason why it is so, and not otherwise. Now, even if we are unaware of the existence of the principle of sufficient reason, we feel a priori that something must have a reason, a cause that explains the push, rather than only describing it. For example, say you are entering a store and you are charged €5 for your item, but the customer next to you is charged only €1 for the same item. Now, you ask the merchant, why the price discrepancy? It could be that the merchant gives you a good reason, or that you just conclude that the merchant is out of his mind. Whatever the answer may be, in every case you expect a reason for this discrepancy. You do not just accept this as a brute fact. Now, if you are a scientist, your sole occupation is to entertain the question why. And therefore, the importance is indeed very great, since it must truly be called the basis of all science. For by science we understand a system of notions, that is, a totality of connected as opposed to a mere aggregate of disconnected notions. But what is it that binds together the members of a system, if not the principle of sufficient reason? Nearly every science, moreover, contains notions of causes from which the effects may be deduced, and likewise other notions of necessity of conclusions from reasons, as will be seen during the course of this inquiry. Now, it is this very assumption a priori that all things must have their reason, which authorizes us everywhere to search for the why. We may safely call this why the mother of all science. Now, it is rather obvious why you would want a reason for unusual phenomena, a flying elephant for example. But few people actually need a reason for the common or the ordinary, such as time. And this is precisely where the task of the philosopher begins. To question the ordinary and then attempting to explain it. And thus, the reason why I make this video is because in order to understand any philosopher like Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche and so on, we first need to understand the principle of sufficient reason. And in order to do so, we will look at the extended description that Schopenhauer provides in his masterpiece on the Fourfold Root of the principle of sufficient reason. In this book, Schopenhauer distinguishes 4 different types of principle of sufficient reason, which form the root of the principle itself, hence the name. Now these 4 principles are that of becoming, that of knowing, that of being, and that of acting. To understand the first principle, we first need to understand the difference between cause and reason. And a very clear description is given by Aristotle in his book Posterior Analytics, where he shows at considerable length that knowing and proving that a thing exists is a very different thing from knowing and proving why it exists. What he represents as the latter being knowledge of the cause, and as the former knowledge of the reason. Thus, the reason is associated with a motive, whereas the cause is the knowledge of why a thing exists. And in the present class of objects for the subject, the principle of sufficient reason appears as the law of causality. And as such, I call it the principle of sufficient reason of becoming. This principle is as follows. If a new state of one or more real objects appears, then there must be another previous state from which the new one follows according to a rule. Such a sequence is called a consequence. The first state a cause, the second an effect. For example, the sun's rays falling on a burning lens. This perhaps by a cloud moving away from the direction of the sun. This by wind, this by uneven density of air, this by other states, and so on to infinity. Now in this example of the sun's ray falling on the burning lens, there is not just one cause that can be pointed to. For the cloud moving is the cause of the sun hitting the lens, but the density of air changing is the cause of the cloud moving in the first place. Now we might call the cloud moving away the cause par excellence, since it is the last and decisive condition that determines if the lens is burning or not. But it is however rare that there is only one cause that can explain a phenomenon. Now, according to Schopenhauer, it is absurd to describe an object as the cause of another. This is because objects do not merely contain form and quality, but also matter. And matter might be altered, but it is never lost. For example, one might bake clay to make a brick. The clay is altered into the form of a brick, but no matter did arise nor perish. And it is precisely because of these alterations that this class is called the class of becoming. For the cause acting on matter changes the representation of this matter, and thus it is becoming something new. I call this form of our principle the principle of sufficient reason of becoming, because its application at all times presupposes an alteration, the appearance of a new state, thus a becoming. Further, it belongs to its essential character that the cause always precedes the effect in time, and only through this will it be first recognized which of the two states bound by the causal nexus is cause and which effect. The only essential distinction between humans and animals, which has always been attributed to reason, is based on the fact that humans have a class of representations which no animal shares. These are concepts, that is, abstract representations, as opposed to the intuitive representations from which, however, concepts are derived. The immediate result of this is that animals neither speak nor laugh. But the mediate result is the many and significant ways in which human life is distinguished from that of the animal. For a different form of motivation has now come about through the addition of abstract representations. Our thought, that is, the abstraction of the world in concepts, is what separates us from animals. It is the cause of our far superior survival skills. But it is also the cause of our suffering, for we no longer see animals as our brothers. We have been alienated from them by the use of concepts. Now, thinking belongs to the realm of representations, since all of us think in images or symbols, or in Lacanian terms, in the imaginary and the symbolic dimensions. Just as I now say the word tree. You either see a tree in your mind, or you repeat the words in your mind in the form of language. And this is how we humans can create an image of the world in our minds using concepts, in which the process of trial and error is played out without the consequence of real death. And we use this representation to make decisions. And thus these decisions imply judgment. Such a clearly thought out and expressed relation of concepts is specifically called a judgment. Now, in relation to this judgment, the principle of reason is again applicable. However, in a very different form from the one stated in the previous chapter. Namely, as the principle of reason, of knowing, implies reason. As such, it says that if a judgment would express knowledge, it must have a sufficient ground. And on account of this property, it receives the predicate true. It is the battle between concepts that can only be won by one particular concept on the basis of sufficient grounds. For when we claim to know the grounds for a judgment, we have to have sufficient reason to call this judgment true. And this reason is based on our knowledge. Let's take the simplest example of a judge in a courthouse. Now, whatever the judge might give as a punishment to a crime, we demand that it has a sufficient reason. We do not want a judge, for example, that treats shoplifting as a worse crime than murder. Therefore, this judgment should be based on sufficient reason that is provided by our concepts and knowledge. And thus, the difference with the previous principle, that of becoming, is that this principle is concerned with reason, the ground, rather than merely the cause. Although us humans question a lot of things, there are some things that we almost never question. Some things that are so self-evident to us that they form the basis of our image of reality itself. This would be space and time. We do not need knowledge or concepts to understand these. They simply appear to us as a priori intuitions. And the way in which space and time appear to us is in position and succession. For example, when you are standing at a crossroads and you can either go left or right, there is no reason required to overthink if there is even a difference between the one and the other with regards to position. They appear as different either way. We do not ask, why is this left and why is this right? For time, succession can be seen in numbers. For 2 comes after 1, 3 after 2, and so on. And this just appears as a fact to us, just as time is always moving forward. Now, I call the law according to which the parts of space and time determine one another with regards to these relations, the principle of sufficient reason of being. Now, this principle is thus different from the other principles seen before, since it does not need causality nor a reason in order to take time and space as a truth. It is part of our being. It shows that this relation is completely different both from that between cause and effect and from that between cognitive ground and consequence, which is why the condition may be called reason of being, ratio ascendi. It goes without saying that insight into such a ground of being can become a ground of knowledge, just as an insight into the law of causality and its application in a specific case is a ground of knowledge of the effect. However, this in no way annuls the complete difference between the ground of being, of becoming, and of knowing. Now, as described here, these 3 principles can be complementary to one another. Take, for example, a thermometer that is rising. The rising is perceived as being, for we can see the liquid in the thermometer going up. And according to the law of causality, the cause of the thermometer rising is an increase in heat. And this increase in heat is a ground, a reason, that can be used for a judgment. For example, that it is hot today. The reason of acting is maybe the hardest of the 4 principles to understand. We have seen in the previous principles our position in the world of causality and reason. However, this causality and reason was always outside ourselves, only in objects, in the physical world, giving an outer intuition. We see the representation of the world unfolding before our eyes, and we can describe this world by using cause and reason, using our lines, bodies, and concepts. But we will always remain outside. We can explain the push, but we can never know the push. In the physical world, we do see a cause necessarily producing its effect. But we do not experience how it actually is able to do so, or what goes on inside. Thus, we see mechanical, physical, chemical effects, and also those of stimuli, following their respective causes every time, without understanding the event through and through. Rather, what is essential remains a mystery to us. So, we then attribute it to properties of bodies, natural forces, even the vital force, which, however, are merely occult qualities. We may know how our heart is beating, but we can never control or be our beating heart. It is what Schopenhauer calls the will, and it is this will that makes our heart beat, in the same way that water in the river flows, the apple falls from the tree to the ground, and so on. Thus, in contrast to the principles before, where the cause, the ground, came from without, in the subject of willing, the motivation comes from within. The result of this is the important proposition: motivation is causality seen from within. Causality thus presents itself here in a completely different way, in a completely different medium, for a completely different type of cognition. And so it must be presented as a special and particular form of our principle, which thus appears here as the principle of sufficient reason, of acting. The place of the will is the place of our unconscious, our drives and our desires, which we control just as little as our thoughts emerging, or our dreams from presenting themselves in our sleep. We only ever see the objectification of this will, which would be the representation, our image of the world. We can clearly see here how people like Freud and Lacan came to their school of psychoanalysis. The will could be seen as the Lacanian real, our inner being which can never be grasped, but it represents itself as our symbolic and imaginary dimensions. Take for example gravity. We know it exists, but we can only ever see the representation of its will. We can only see the apple falling, but we can never see or know gravity itself. These are the four principles that make up the principle of sufficient reason. The first aspect of this principle is that of becoming, where it states that if matter is altered, there must be a cause which precedes the effect. The second aspect is that of knowledge, which is concerned with our abstract representations of the world. And this principle states that for a judgment to be made, there should be a ground on which the conclusion is drawn. The third aspect is that of being in space and time. This principle shows that the existence of one relation necessarily implies the other. For example, if a coin has a front, it necessarily has a backside. And finally, the last aspect is that of acting. It is motivation as causality seen from within. It states that whenever we as humans undertake action, we need a motivation to do so. And this motivation is called the will. And this brings us to the end of the video. I do apologize if the video might appear somewhat boring due to the use of the large amount of quotes, but I could just not formulate Schopenhauer in a better way than he himself did. If there is anything that is still unclear, you can always ask us anything in the comments below. And if you did reach the end of this video, I really hope that you learned something from it. For I know that I learned a lot from making this video. For now, I wish you a good day, or night for the ones that like to watch hardcore philosophy videos just before going to sleep. And I hope that something good happens to you today, and to see you in the next video.